Hello, everybody, and welcome to the July 20th, 2021 instance of the SIG Windows Kubernetes community meeting. As always, these meetings are recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so please adhere to all of the CNCF Code of Conduct. Let's get started. All right, first introductions, if anybody wants to introduce themselves. Maybe in a couple of weeks, we can do another full round of introductions, at least the leads, to see, just to keep that fresh. But if not, or until then, anybody can just kind of introduce themselves if they want. If not, we'll get into the announcements. So we are kind of nearing the end of the 122 release cycle. Today is the deadline for any doc reviews to be marked as reviewable. So the requirements for this are just to have your SIG labeled and have technical reviewers from your SIG assigned to review any doc PRs, and also to make sure the PR is not in draft status. I believe the docs freeze is still next week, but let's get reviews on that. I've tried to list all of the open reviews that we have here, and we can go into those in a minute. Next announcement is James finally managed to get his fix for the VXLAN dual stack issues in the WinKernel proxy merged. That took a while, and I think I saw that this morning there were some backports open. Do you have anything you wanted to add about that, James, or?
No, yeah, so there's just a backport to 121 because it was only an issue from 121 plus.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was an interest. I'm surprised that took so long. It was an interesting set of issues. Okay, so for docs, mainly, I think these are I was looking through the website Kubernetes website repository, and these are this is a combination of what I was already tracking and reviewing and what had the SIG Windows label on it. There's a couple of PR updates for the host process containers. There's the general feature promotion or introduction PR, and then there's also a blog post that Brandon's been working on. Thank you for all that, Brandon. Anybody who's interested, please review. The more eyes we can get on it, the more, I guess, general and open we can make it, the better. Do you have anything you wanted to add about that, Brandon? Are there any particular issues or areas that you would like people to look at, or?
Yeah, no, just any sort of general content would be, fine. Feel free to add whatever you think is pertinent. There's still some content that I'm going to be adding in the next day or two. So just let me know if you have anything else you want to add.
Yeah, I've been starting reviews on that too. I think I have most of mine still in the GitHub draft review, but it looks like it's in good shape. We're getting there.
All right, cool.
James also added, so we do have a package that we are producing here that has updated container dbits, HDS shim bits, and everything that are needed to run host process containers coming out of this branch, just to help get everything together. I think we are going to plan on moving the GitHub action that makes this package into SIG Windows tools, just to make it more accessible. James, did you have anything you wanted to add for that? I think you just added that.
Yeah, so the job components merged into HCS shim, so you just have to build off HCS shim for the main branch of HCS shim to build those, and then the container D part is based off of Perry's PR, which we're just waiting for the CRY components to be merged into container D, the 122 changes. But just wanted to share this if anybody wants to try it out. There's a package that's in the same format as the upstream container D, and it has everything built for you, so you don't have to go through those steps yourself.
Yeah, and to expand on that a little bit, the container D project, generally vendors in all of the CRY updates after the Kubernetes release is cut. So I think we're waiting until August 4th potentially before those CRY changes will get ingested into container D, and after that we can get Perry's updates merged, which use all of those new API fields. So that'll be exciting. And then that will make it even more accessible for people to run and test these host process containers.
A quick question about that.
Sure.
the stuff that's being built off of your branch, Mark, eventually we won't need to do this, right?
Yeah. So in order to have this, like these changes not take many Kubernetes releases, we have instrumented, or we're controlling these host process containers with annotations that are passed along the cry calls. And those changes are like working. All of the cry calls pass in all of the needed cry calls pass in the annotations that they get from all the way down to the HTS shim layer to control all of this. But at the same time, we added proper fields to the cry API to control this. So these changes are going to, or once these changes land, we're going to remove setting the annotations along the cry calls and do this with the native CRI API calls. But those changes require the cry API updates to already be in containerd in the consuming components. So once those merge, then yeah, we hope to just be able to build. Well, so after that, we'll vendor in a new HTS shim. We'll vendor in all of the HTS shim changes into containerd, and the containerd package itself does come with the shim binaries needed. So eventually, hopefully, just a couple, like the next release after Perry's changes merge, all you'll need to do is grab the containerd package from the containerd release and run that, and then enable anything in the various Kubernetes components.
And I'm just wondering, the reason I was asking the question is I'm wondering about the timing of all this. When will all of this hopefully happen before Docker shim is deprecated?
Hopefully. So containerd, like the containerd package today works without the, like if you're not relying on these host process containers. So that's already kind of up to date, and you can just grab that and run with cry containerd. For the timing of the host process containers specifically, I think it's a little bit unknown. Some folks started taking a look the other day about the release process and release timelines for a new containerd release. And it looks like they're working towards a 1.6 release, which would be the first containerd release that would contain these changes. I don't think that they'd be willing to backport these or add these to a patch release because it is new functionality. And I don't really have any insight into the kind of when they're hoping to get the 1.6 release out. It doesn't seem like there's a fixed release schedule for the containerd project.
So we should just prepare for having, once we move to containerd, at least from a release perspective, not have host process support until they release a newer version that doesn't require all these other bits to be included or other changes to be, sort of backfilled, not from the main repos, is what I think I'm hearing. Yeah,
not from a containerd release. Part of the website updates that we're going to do we're going to highlight that there is that we're still waiting on the containerd bits to be released. Well, so that will have a bigger impact once we remove the annotations. So once I think even, yeah, let me think. That'll have a bigger impact once we remove all of the annotations, and that will be necessary to get some of the host networking stuff that Perry was working on lit up. But yes, unfortunately, we're going to be a little bit behind.
Okay, yeah, because I've been telling some folks that once we move to containerd, we'll get host process. But I guess we'll have to wait a little bit for that to happen. Just wanted to make sure I got my ducks lined up correctly.
Mm-hmm. And I think that'll be some motivation to move this, like this GitHub repository that's linked here is super simple. It's just a GitHub action that enlists in a couple of repositories, builds the binaries from the head, and then releases a zip package with that. Mm-hmm. There's, I guess, moving this into one of the Kubernetes SIGs repositories might make it a little bit more official and easy to consume, but it will still be, you'll still need to build like the tip of containerd to get the functionality for a while.
Okay.
And we will, we're going to have some discussions around feature promotion for this when we do some kept updates for 123 for this. Definitely, we're going, like, it's not going stable until all the container components are released and well validated. But we'll have to have some discussions around the beta timeframe too, or going to beta.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Mark.
Any other questions about the current status of process containers?
Are we planning to keep it behind the feature flag until it's out of alpha or out of beta? Out of interest. So when are we taking off the need to put the flag on to get host process?
So generally how the features progress is in alpha, it's off by default, and then in beta, it's on by default. So I think we'll follow, unless there's a need to change that. I think we'll probably just follow that guidance. And then once it's stable, usually there still is a feature flag for a couple of releases, but you can't turn it off. It's locked to on for, I think, reasons for upgrade.
Cool.
Does that work for you?
Yeah. It's more just because I know there's a lot of things that suddenly like that opens up when it comes on. And if you've got customers that are like, I want to use, I don't know, CNI in a pod, or I want to use Prometheus in a pod, then you're kind of saying, well, you've got to enable this feature flag to use it. Be nice to be able to say you don't need to do that, but just know that it's sort of beta support almost.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we can have some of those conversations during the next set of kept updates as well. Cool. We're talking about this, but okay. Yeah, if anybody has any other questions or anything, just feel free to ask in any of the usual channels. Next was the CSI proxy support is going to stable. I believe that I saw all of the necessary components had their v1.0 release, and this is just a quick update to the website with a little bit more details, some installation instructions, and just stating that this support is now stable. And then there is just a general updates PR that I started that is just updating, like, where we do a little bit of routine the grooming, like the supported versions of Windows and everything. If there's anything kind of general that needs to get updated in the Windows support page, it's a good place to add a comment. All right, so next, or the only other thing on the agenda was I wanted to revisit the kept that Ravi is bringing forward for introducing, or for identifying Windows pods at admission time. I had a chance to take a look through this. I think a couple of other folks did. So the background here is that there is the new pod security policy replacement that was put in, I think, in alpha in 122. There were a lot of open questions about how do we limit policy enforcement for OS specific policies to pods when there is not a kind of a canonical way of doing that in the pod spec. There were a couple of ideas that were floated around, and one of them was to use runtime classes. So because runtime classes generally will have an OS, like a node selectors on them that will restrict which, or that will guide the pods to a particular machine. But also, more importantly, those are more or less validated at the kubelet. So before the containers are started, there were some concerns about just using node selectors or other mechanisms from the SIG security, that it would be possible to bypass the scheduler and not have any kind of OS level enforcement for scheduling those pods. So this way, like whatever runtime you target has to have an entry in, like, has to be associated or installed with the container runtime in order to start that up. So I took a look at this. I think in general, the idea makes sense, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be prohibitively expensive, especially in the API server or at the other kind of critical points in time. I did have a couple of questions, or wanted to see a little bit more clarity around the specific behaviors about what happens if what will happen if Windows pods aren't using runtime classes when they go in. Will they be still subject? Will they just kind of go through and be subject to any Linux specific or global pod security policies that are in flight there? And mainly, I think that that's what a lot of the other KEP reviewers from other SIGs are going to want to see to do that. I don't know. Did anybody else have a chance to look at this or have any thoughts on this? So there were also a couple of other good ideas that came up, I think, in the discussion of this PR. One that was more recent was, so one of the big concerns was that even if you have a node selector that says, or Kubernetes OS equals Windows, there are mechanisms for just placing containers or pods on a machine and not going through the scheduler. I won't go into those here, but one thing that came up was it would be good to add a check in the kubelet to say that, hey, if this pod had an OS node selector on it, make sure that the OS matches the arch that you're running on, or the OS that you're running on, and things like that can help prevent people from maliciously saying, hey, this malicious pod is targeted at Windows, but I'm going to place it on a Linux machine because it's a Linux pod to bypass policy. So that's kind of the main goal of all of these updates for pod security policy, and being able to identify the OS.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of points to that. Tim, who reviewed it from the SIG side, who authored the pod security policies now, which are replacement for PSPs. So he suggested that the approach, say if you go with the runtime classes, the admission plugin that I need to use should be runtime class one. I was initially thinking, should I go with the runtime class admission plugin, or should I go with the existing pod security admission plugin that is newly created, which is an alpha stage. So the point he made was, say if we go with the runtime class, it's actually a mutating admission plugin, and the validating admission plugin, the pod security one, the latest one, it's a validating one, so it will be run after the runtime class has already been run. So I still need some clarity on that, in the sense that what are we going to do within the runtime class? Because obviously we need to make some changes in the runtime class as well as in the pod security plugin. In the pod security plugin, what needs to be done is something that we still need to figure out, because say if the runtime class admission plugin has already been run, we would have both runtime class as well as the node selector updated to include the host OS. So should we take both of them into consideration while authoritatively saying that this is a Windows pod, or can we just go with the runtime class? So that is question number one. Number two, I was initially thinking that on the kubelet side, the changes would be sort of minimal, like instead of rejecting, we would strip the pod security policies, which we are doing currently. But I think after looking at Tim's points, where we can bypass the node spec, we do not have this in OpenShift because we have an admission plugin which blocks people to directly update the node name. So I do not think from those lines. So we perhaps need to include the SIG node folks in reviewing this, because we are going to reject the pod during the admission time on the kubelet side again, instead of stripping those security policies. So those two are additional points that I still need to work through. And Mark, I have updated with a sample implementation PR, which shows how to use, like which admission plugin is actually going to use the runtime classes authoritatively. So I have used the runtime class admission plugin as an example. those are the points that I wanted to add. Like if folks have any other questions, please let us know.
Yeah, so I couldn't fully parse what Tim was trying to say. So he's not saying don't use runtime classes, right?
No, he's not saying that.
Okay.
The point he's trying to make is, like say if you go with runtime classes and we use node selector as the authoritative field to say that it's a Windows pod, I would like to have the same logic applied at the kubelet level, saying that I'm using node selector. Say if the node selector is kubernetes.io/os equal to Windows, and if the runtime says the operating system is not Windows, I would like to ensure that the pod itself gets rejected before it reaches a stage where it goes to the runtime and then we try to bring up that container.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's not like, yeah, so we would, yeah, so we would go away from doing what we're doing today, which is where we're stripping Linux specific stuff on a Windows pod. We just strip it away before it's added to the node, right? Or
It's not even
allowed to
stripping
run.
it. Yeah, we would even reject the pod during the admission time on the kubelet, not at the API server admission time, but say if someone has bypassed the API server and they have given the pod, the API server validation, and they have given the node name directly. On the node itself, what we would do is we would check for the existence of runtime class, and we would check for the node selector if both of them exist. And if runtime.goose is not equal to Windows, deny the admission itself in the kubelet code.
Yeah, so the other question I have is, this might be coming from lack of knowledge. There is no way, can you bring up an API server and somehow not have these validation and admission plugins running? Or that's just not doable? Like people will have to go really, compile code out and things like that to make that happen.
So usually what we do is there are set of plugins that we want always to be enabled, and we would register them during the API server startup. So the pod security plugin is something that is already wired in. Runtime classes is already wired in. So people have to take that line where we are registering, and then they have to do a recompilation.
Yeah, so that's what I was hoping for. Like somebody needs to actually explicitly try and disable this. It's not like add some config somewhere and it'll stop working, right?
Yeah, for some of the built-in ones, it's my understanding
Yeah,
too, is
okay.
that you can't just like patch a config map and disable them.
It is slightly changing in the OpenShift side, but we can talk about that later. Like not in this meeting, but yeah.
Yeah. No, my question was general, Ravi, not OpenShift specific. Yeah. I think I know what you're talking about, but yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
That's all I have. I just want to reiterate that if you go with the runtime classes, we are sort of going to force people to use runtime classes in future. Like if people have just the node selector and no runtime class, it is going to cause a problem. So I just want to reiterate that if people have issues with that, please let us know. You can react. You can respond to that on the PR, or you can reach out to us on Slack or anything like that.
Hey, Ravi, could you repeat your concern? I couldn't fully understand that.
So the existing users, say if they have node selector, we are going to take a phased approach and say that in 24 timeframe, say perhaps if everything goes fine, and in 124 we are going to graduate to beta with this particular plugin. We may actually throw a warning in the first release saying that you just have a node selector, but you do not have a runtime class which has kubernetes.io/os as a node selector. And in the subsequent releases, when we GA, and we plan to align this particular code change to come in with the GA and beta of pod security admission plugin. So by that time, say if the users just have node selector and they do not have a runtime class, it is going to cause a problem to them. Like the existing pods will run, but say if they gets updated or something happens, the admission would be denied at the API server level.
that is one of my biggest concerns here too. If possible, I'd like to get to a point where if they aren't running with like pod security policy or other things, they don't need to specify the runtime class. Just to make it a little bit easier for people to get, up and running with Windows.
So if the
Yeah, I think, sorry, go ahead.
if the runtime class is a mutating webhook, is it possible, since the node selector of Windows OS is well known, to kind of translate that to and create a I guess you can't create during that time period, but all right, no, never mind. I was just kind of thinking out loud. It was like maybe there's a way to translate that into a runtime class for them if they don't have it, so that
Actually, we can, and that's one of the things that I've mentioned in the CAP. What we are going to do is we are going to have an example admission plugin, a mutating web technically, which modifies, like it looks at the node selector and say if the Kubernetes.io OS exists and no runtime class exists, it is automatically going to create one, but it's not going to be enabled by default, and this is just going to be an example one. Like showing people how to do that. Because the main problem with creating those runtime classes is it's sort of a cluster admin specific activity. From a security standpoint, if we create those runtime classes for them, I do not know how well it would fly with the security.
And there is, if you just take container D, I think James found this or pointed this out a while ago, if you just take container D and you tell it to do a config dump, there is a default runtime class in there. So like I keep going back and forth, should we try and add, like just in my mind, do we try and add that default container D runtime, or like the runtime class that's in the default container D install? It like in this case, or what do we do? I think that this is probably the most important thing that we need to get consensus on out of the whole KEP. Like, do we are we okay with essentially requiring runtime classes in order to get your Windows pods scheduled several releases down the line? And my personal feeling is like, if we can avoid it, I would like to do that, because runtime classes are very cluster specific, but I don't think that we really have a better approach or like a better path forward here too. So
yeah, I think like the main problem is from a security side, we have always suggested that do not use node selector directly because it's unsecure. But in the Windows documentation, right from the start, we have told that node selector plus tolerations combination is good. Whereas we know that these problems existed for a long time. So if we had gone with the runtime classes, it would have been okay. But the runtime classes came in later, right? I mean, 2016, 2018, that's when these actually sort of happened. So I think from a user experience, yes, perhaps it's going to cause a problem, but in the long term, I think it's better for the customers too.
Yeah, I think the sooner we kind of get users comfortable with runtime classes, the better is what I'm hearing. And especially when you have multiple versions of Windows, runtime classes just makes it a little bit more elegant.
Yeah, I think that I need to check the docs again, but I think that they do say in order to run multiple, in order to have a cluster that has like, Windows Server 2019 and then like 2002 or 20H2 nodes in it at the same time, it is preferable to use runtime classes to target the Windows nodes. So it's not a new concept, but as Ravi mentioned, like the initial guidance or the first place people are going to see mention of how do I schedule Windows nodes is going to say just use the Kubernetes IO/OS label
as the node selector.
Yeah.
So which actually brings me to the next point. Like since we know that this is going to cause a problem, and we know that node selector plus tolerations are insecure, can we actually update the docs now in the 122 timeframe, say that this is actually preferred or recommended, and because this actually gets the guidance out to folks a bit earlier?
Probably not for 122, but for 123, yes. I think, I mean, maybe for 122 also, but I don't think we have a whole lot of time to get that done, but yes.
No, I'm talking about, I'm sorry, I'm just talking about the docs changes where we tell that this is perhaps the recommended way, and we just give a hint that in future they may be taken out if we have consensus that we want to go with the runtime classes.
Yeah, I think we can do that. The other thing that was actually suggested in some of the pod security policy kind of talks, and you did mention it, that in OpenShift you guys just have a plugin that will block anything that will block a lot of admission that has node name already set. I wonder if that, like, we've kind of floated that idea here too, to add a built-in admission controller that will do that, that will restrict setting node names except for a couple of very specific roles. But I think that does, like, I think that the runtime classes will help with a lot of other scenarios too. So
yeah, like I think we proposed it in the past, but I do not remember the exact reasons, because this was beyond when I started working on. This is before I started working on OpenShift, so I do not have history why it got rejected, or was it never proposed. I am unclear on that. But is that something that you want to combine in this effort, or you see it as a different thing?
I see it as a different thing, but maybe it be worth calling out, at least in this KEPA, as an alternate approach.
Well, like the node name is fine, but the tolerations, that would still be a problem. Like,
yeah, there's
tolerations would still be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So unless we have our background tolerations and node selector, that again is sort of a problem.
Yeah, that's some of the other sheets.
Okay. So do you want me to open the docs PR, or
if you want, if you have a chance to do that today, yeah, go ahead and do some of that and we can review it. If not, I'll try and add them. I can try and add them to the general updates PR that I opened. But I might not, I'm pretty meeting heavy today, so I won't be able to get to that until at least later this afternoon or tonight. But if I get to it.
Yeah, same thing. Like today may be too hard for me, but I think I'll be able to do it by tomorrow. Okay.
Yeah, we can just work over Slack and see who gets to it first.
Okay. Yeah, that works.
Yep. Okay. I am going to run to the SIG node meeting. James or Jay, do one of you want to be the lead? Are we done with the, does anybody have anything else for the community meeting, or are we going into the pairing? All right, sounds
I don't
like
have anything else. I mean, quick announcement for folks that are here. We do have Calico now working in the dev environment. So if you want to test the latest version of Calico 3.19 on Kubernetes 1.22 or Antria, we support both of those. And if anybody wants to add other CNIs, like, let me know. We can look at them. But I think that's probably good enough for now.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to stop recording now. Bye all.